All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors, for the month of Adar, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shumer and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Tina Bas Pesach and Zechariah ben Zechariah. We thank our Daf Yomi, Parak Pesachim sponsors, Maishi and Chavi Abramson, for dedicating the entire parak in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Daniel Meir ben Chana. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, all those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, and all of the neshama should have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. Well, so with that, let us begin. So we have a very exciting daf ahead of us today. Quite interesting and esoteric discussions. So we are picking up in Meretz Hashem. Today's daf is Kuf Yud Aleph 111, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on the bottom of Kuf Yud 110. Amar Rav Chinana Breid Rav Yoshua. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. Amar Rav Chinana Breid Rav Yoshua. So we'll say still talking a little bit more about the topic of zugos. So comes Rav Chinana Breid Rav Yoshua and says as follows: Ispargus mitzarif l'tova ve'im mitzarif l'ra. So we'll say ispargus. Now, what is ispargus? If you take a look at the Rashbam, I remember again on this staff, the Rashbam is on the right-hand column. Ispargus it's in the shorter lines, probably about 8 lines from before it gets wide. So ispargus, belashon parsi korin lekruv ispargus, vezeu sheshaninu hanoder min akruv aser beispargus. Umashkenu shosem mikruv umiyayin, uregilan hayu l'shtoso bechol boker l'refua, kodem achila. So this is interesting. So aspargus was a wine cabbage drink. Interesting. I had a drink made of cabbage and wine. It was drunk every morning, in the morning, before you ate. And it was a person would drink it for refuah purposes. Again, what exactly it did refuah-wise, I don't know. But again, this was a common drink. So aspargus, mitzarif l'tov ve'im mitzarif l'ra. So also we've seen this concept before. So aspargus, for example, if a person went ahead and drank 2 cups of wine, and then drank, or 2 cups of anything, and then went ahead and drank a cup of aspargus, so aspargus is there to break up the zugos. It could count as cup number 3. But if you then went and drank another cup, aspargus number 3 doesn't combine with cup number 4 to create the zugos issue. Also, we've seen this already before, right? That there are certain things which are what we call mitzarif l'tova, ve'ino mitzarif l'ra. So the Gemara goes weiter. Amra Avina b'shmei derava zugi l'chumra v'amri lei zugi l'kulas. We'll say this is an interesting case. What happens if you drank a certain number of glasses of wine, and as could happen after you drink a certain number of glasses of wine, you don't remember how many you drank. You just don't remember. So now you're nervous that there's the possibility of zugos. So that maybe you drank. So what's the issue? The issue is, let's say I'm not sure, did I drink 2 or 3? See if I go ahead and I drink another one, I drank 2 and I drink 1 more. So great, now I've negated any zugos issues. But if I drank 3 and now I drink another one, I've actually created a zugos issue. So what should I do in a case of suffix? So look at the Gemara. So the machlokis over here that's mentioned is zugi l'chumra, zugi l'kula. Some say you should go l'chumra, some say you should go l'kula. Now look at Rashbam for just a moment. So Rashbam says, first wide line, zugi l'chumra, im eni odeim shasa zugos im lav. If a person doesn't know if he drank zugos or not, so the Gemara says, yishta. Ve'im shasa zugos hoil v'dait l'tzarpam mitzarfin l'tov. Ve'im lo shasa zugos nimlach li'im mitzarfin l'ra. So we'll say, first opinion says, go l'chumra. We'll say, now what does l'chumra mean? Drink another cup. now watch this. Because b'manav shach, what happens? If you drank 2, then the cup that you drink now will be the 3rd. Fantastic. And if you drank 3, and now you're drinking a 4th, it's not a zugos problem. Why not? I will say, because we saw in yesterday's daf, there's the concept of nimlach. Zugos only applies when it's premeditated consumption of even-numbered cups of wine. But for example, if you have 1 cup of wine, and you say, I'm going to have 1 cup of wine, wine was delicious, you decide to have another cup of wine, that does not create a zugos issue. So therefore, the opinion that says l'chumra says you have nothing to lose by drinking the extra cup of wine. Amri le zuga l'kula. Look at the next Rashbam, second wide line. But some say l'kula shelo yishta. The chayvan the shasi gali adaiti the kapet azugos. So listen to this. So the chayvan the shasi gali adaiti the kapet azugos. V'mei karlo bezugos avakai v'ashashtem mitzarfidu bahadi adadi hilchach lo yishte dafilu ibezugos avakai dilma kayvan delo kapet lo kapet. So the second opinion says, what did we say yesterday? We'll say, remember again, we kind of thought that we brought the zugos issue to a conclusion. And what was the conclusion of the zugos issue? Remember again, what was the conclusion? If you're makbid, it has an effect on you. If you're not makbid, it doesn't have an effect on you. So the opinion that says lakula, don't drink another cup, says very simply, listen, if you drank 3, you're in good shape anyway. And if you drank 2, if you start drinking another cup, or you drank 2 versus 3, if you start drinking another cup, and it turns out now that you drank 4, it shows that you're makbid on zugos. And if you're makbid on zugos, apparently says the Gemara, that's when you make yourself vulnerable. So an interesting discussion here. I'm not sure, did I drink zugos? Did I not drink zugos? Machlokes shayrizalvat l'chumra, just drink another cup. Because again, if you drank an even number, then the new cup will offset zugos. Even if you drank an odd number, and now the extra cup is a zugos cup, that's okay because it's nimlach. You're deciding. Other opinion, lakula, leave it alone. Leave it alone. Zugos could only impact you if you're nervous, if you're makbid on it. So if you drink, you show that you're makbid on it. Just leave it alone. Which I will say is an interesting, hashkafa, if you think about it, in terms of how is one supposed to deal with life uncertainty and life challenge. And often there's 2 different ways to deal with difficulties, challenges, or uncertainty. Sometimes you have to be proactive, and sometimes you have to be inactive. Right? Sometimes I have a challenge, and my obligation is to step up and do something. That's l'chumra. I have to do something. But sometimes, interestingly enough, the best way to deal with certain life challenges is let it go, right? Kind of leave things alone. Now you have to be careful because sometimes people let things go because they're apathetic or because they're nervous or because they're scared to do something. But again, it's this incredible dialectic in life. Sometimes you have to be proactive and solve your problems, and sometimes you have to be a little bit passive and kind of let things play out. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rav Yosef, trade the chamra v'trade the shechur lo mitztarif. So we'll see, interesting, Rav Yosef says, 2 cups of wine, 2 cups of beer are not mitztarif v'zugos. I'm sorry. Trade the chamra v'chad the shechur lo mitztarif. 2 cups of wine with 1 cup of beer is not mitztarif. So Rav Yosef, if you drink 2 cups of wine, you have a zugos issue. Drinking a 3rd cup of beer does not help you with your zugos issue. The logic behind these cases, as we're going to see in just a moment, is because wine is chashuv, beer is not as chashuv as wine, which means beer does not really enter into the equation once you're consuming wine. So if you want to offset 2 cups of wine because of zugos, you're going to need to drink another cup of wine. So the Gemara says, trade the shikra b'chad b'chamra mitztarif. However, the opposite is not true. If you have 2 cups of beer and now you have a zugos issue, 1 cup of wine can go ahead and offset the zugos issue, which I will say makes sense because wine is more chashuv than beer. Wine is more, although again, interestingly enough, before you saw this Gemara, we would have kind of assumed that that they don't mix, cups don't mix. In other words, that because the whole issue of zugos seems to be pairs of like items. Interestingly enough, what the Gemara is telling me is that if I have a zugos issue, drinking something that's less chashuv than my zugos won't help my zugos issue. But if I have a zugos issue, drinking something more chashuv will help the zugos issue. Good. V'simamich, and the way to remember this is za'aklal kala mechuber lo min ha'chomer mimenu tamei me'akam min atar. So we'll say again, the way to remember this, although I don't know why this is an easy way to remember, because it's tumantara. So the Gemara says, easy way to remember is if you have a piece of fabric that doesn't have the requisite shear, and you attach more fabric to the original fabric, if the new fabric ultimately is more chashuv than the old fabric, then the new combined fabric forms the requisite shear for tumah. However, if the new fabric is less chashuv than the first fabric, then Allah says it's not mitzdarif to form the requisite shear. Incredibly helpful. A wonderful way to remember. It's also easier just to remember wine combines with beer, beer doesn't combine with wine. That's the simple way to remember. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Amrav Nachman, Amrav, Trey Kama Taka. So Rav Nachman says, if you have 2 cups of wine literally before your meal and 1 cup of wine at the meal, those are mitztarif. However, but ultimately, again, 1 before your meal and 2 at the meal are not mitztarif. So the Gemara says, why? So ultimately says the Gemara, are we trying to remedy the table? In other words, what does the presence of the table before the meal, after the meal, have to do with anything? Gavra ba'inon, the Gavra kamiskan v'koi. So Gemara says we're trying to remedy a zugos issue for a person. And lamaisa, as long as the individual is not drinking an even number of cups, we're good to go. So what does it matter if he drank 2 cups before the meal, 1 cup at the meal, 1 cup at the meal, 2 cups? What does it make a difference? At the end of the day, as long as, again, he ends up drinking an odd number of cups, we should be good to go. Rather, I will say the Gemara says as follows. What we are talking about over here is as follows. If you drank 2 cups of wine at your meal, and one after the meal, I will say now, labasar tacha literally means after the table. That's literally means it means after the table, which I will say again. Remember, we keep going back to this same basic model that we've always been discussing, namely that when they would finish eating, they would take away the table. So the Gemara says as follows: if you drank 2 cups of wine while the table was present, and then they took away the table, and you drank another cup of wine, lo mitztarfi, then those 3 cups are not mitztarf. Since the 3rd cup, you drank the 3rd cup after the table was removed, it is not mitztaref to the other 2 cups. Kiyahi maisa the Rabbi Bar Nachmani, like the story of Rabbi Bar Nachmani. So we'll say Rashbam alludes to this story. The story of Rabbi Bar Nachmani is that the government had sent someone to go ahead and apprehend Rabbi Bar Nachmani. The individual went ahead and drank 2 cups of wine, zugos, at the table, and he had some type of crazy situation where his face turned backwards. So Rabba said, bring back the table to give him the 3rd. So the fact that they brought back the table to go and give him the 3rd cup of wine indicates to us that halacha lamaisa, you could only go ahead and remedy the zugos in the presence of the table. Good. Amr Rabbi Yehuda Mishmuel, kala mazug mitzayif. I will say any diluted drinks, and when I guess mazug, I guess diluted is the right, yeah. Any diluted drinks by definition are mitzayif. So I will say what this means is as follows. So for example, wine was a diluted drink, right? You would go out and you would drink 1 part wine concentrate to 3 parts water. So if you have wine and another diluted drink, right, another drink that's made through some type of dilution, ultimately, again, they combine. So we'll say, what the Gemara is introducing us to is the interesting idea, and we kind of already saw this with beer and wine, that halacha l'maisa, although the classic case of zugos is where you're drinking 2 cups, or hopefully not 2 cups, hopefully 3 cups of liquid, of a drink. Usually we're assuming it's the same. The Gemara spoke about beer and wine where you could have different items. Now the Gemara is saying there are certain items that are considered to be like items because of the way they're prepared. So all diluted drinks have the status of one type of drink. So the Gemara says, top of Kuf Yudav, chutz min hamayim, with the exception of water. In other words, we'll say if you go ahead and you Rashbam points out over here, if you go ahead and you mix together, warm water and cold water, that's not considered to be a mixed drink. That's one min. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu mayim. Rabbi Yochanan says no, even water. Amar papalo Amar ela chamimi lego kariri. The kariri lego chamimi. That's only true. In other words, when can you consider potentially water a mixed drink? Only if it's hot water and cold water mixed together. Ava chamimi lego chamimi. The kariri lego kariri lo. But warm water or hot water into hot water or cold water into cold water will not be considered a mixed drink. Okay, Amar Reish Lakish. Arba dvar ma'osa osan dama barosha mischai benafsha. There are 4 things I will say where if a person does it, essentially he puts himself in mortal danger. Danger, and he is responsible for anything bad which happens to him. What are the 4 things? Eluhein hanifna bein dekel lakosel. If you urinate between a palm tree and a wall. So we'll say, so the case over here would be, you have a palm tree that's next to a wall, you stand between the palm tree and the wall, and you urinate there. Or if you go ahead and you pass in between 2 palm trees, or if you go ahead and you drink borrowed water, or you walk over spilled water, even if it's your wife who spilled out the water in your presence. Now, I will say, what's the issue over here with all of these things? Now, first, I'll take a look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam says, Arba dvarim mishum ruach ra. All of this is because I will say of ruach ra. Now, this is interesting. I just want to point out all the fascinating things that we're seeing over here, right? So we've seen zugos, which seems to be really like an issue of shadim, right? We've seen kishuf, which again, is a sorcery issue, which doesn't seem to be shadim, and now we're being introduced to what the Rashbam calls ruach ra. Now, I want to point out that often you'll find ruach ra used in two different ways. For example, we wash nigel vaser in the morning, wash the fields in the morning, because again, ruach ra, there's ruach ra shal yadayim. Now that ruach ra is a function of the fact that the Gemara says that sleep is achos mishishim of misa, right? Sleep is 1/68 of death. So that ruach ra that we have in the morning is actually associated with death. Ruach ra often is also used synonymously with shadim. Once again, shadim. And it's clear from this Gemara, as we're going to see in just a bit, that all four of these issues are shadim issues. So even though the Rashbam is calling it ruach ra, it really is a shadim issue. So here we go. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, what's wrong with urinating in between the wall and the palm tree? Lo amar ela de lesli arba amos. That's only true if there's not arba amos, 4 amos in between the palm tree and the wall. Aval isli par arba amos leslanba. But if there's 4 amos, you're good to go. Both say, what's happening over here? So the Rashbam says as follows. So both say, shadim, when they travel amongst men, don't travel in the normal thoroughfares of people. Instead, they travel by the periphery. Right, they travel by the side. So a shade would be most prone, says the Rashbam, to travel, in the area by the wall, right, between the palm trees and the walls on the side of the road. They don't travel on the major road with people on the side. So what's the issue? The issue is if a person is urinating by the side of the road in between a palm tree and a wall, he may block the passage of a shade, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. Not a good idea. It could put a person in danger. So therefore, the Gemara says, if there's more than dalet amis in between the palm tree and the wall, then einachinami, again, the shade has room to get by as well. Not a problem. Lesle arba amos, and if there's not arba amos, lo amar ela deleka dircha achrino. That's also only true if there's not another pathway. Aval ika dircha achrino leslan ba. But if there is another pathway, then there's not a problem. Good, Abba says that's number one. Number two, so we'll say same idea with walking in between 2 palm trees. Again, the imagery is you're walking in between 2 palm trees which are close to each other. So we'll say, so the idea at the end of the day is that halacha l'maisa, a person is obstructing the passage or the not passage. What's the word? The flow of traffic of shadim, right? You're an impasse. So same thing with Shnei Dekal. So that's only true, by the way, if there's not a Rosh Hashanah that runs in between the 2 palm trees. Aval Paskin Rosh Hashanah less. So we'll say obviously you have a Rosh Hashanah that runs between the 2 palm trees. Remember again, we'll say the definition of a Rosh Hashanah is an area that is at least 16 amos wide. So if you have 16 amos of width in between, that is not a problem. Hashosamaim shulin. Similarly, again, if a person drinks borrowed water, lo amran ella. The Gemara says, I'm sorry. Hashosamaim shulin lo amran ella dishailinhu katan. Similarly, again, if did I skip? No, if a person drinks borrowed water, lo amar ela dishalinu katan. That's only if it was borrowed by a child. Aval gadol laslanba. So we'll say, so whatever the reason, shadim drink from water borrowed by a child. So therefore, again, a person goes ahead and is in proximity to this water, that could be dangerous. Aval gadol, but an adult, it's not a problem. Afilu shalinu katan. Even if a child borrowed it, nami lo amran ela bisada. That's only true in the field. Because there's not a lot of water found in the field. Aval be'ir dishchichi, but in the city, where ultimately, again, there's an incredible amount of water, less lanba, there is no problem. Va'afilu b'sada nami lo amran ela mayo. Aval chamra v'shichra less lanba. And even in this field, this is only a problem with water. It's not a problem with water, or with wine or beer. Okay. Next, va'over al mayim shfuchin. If one goes ahead and walks over spilled water, lo amran ela de lo afsekinu ba'afra velo tof behu roka. This is only true if you did not put dirt in the water or spit, put saliva in the water. Aval afsekinu otov behu roka leslanba. But if you went ahead and you put dirt in the water or you spit in the water, there's no problem. Velo amran ela de lo avar alayhu shimsha velo avar alayhu shisin nigri. So we'll say furthermore again, this is also only true if halacha l'maisa, the sun did not pass over it. If you take a look at the Rashbam says over here, Yeah, take a look. Take a look. It's Velo Amran. It's in the Rashbam, third wide line. Velo Amran deshara lamaim elabesad lo shlichi hi umasra nafsha lishtos delo afsekinu ba'arav shlo pizer alei afar. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says Velo Avar alai shisin nigri. Aval Avar alai shimsha va'avar alai shisin nigri less lanba. Fine. So the Gemara will say. So again, just what you see over here is, remember, you're dealing, of course, with more esoteric concepts of shadim. So this is when Chazal felt that the shadim are present over these very specific things. So all it's saying, the Gemara is saying, is if your circumstances don't mirror some exact scenario, halacha l'maaseh is not a problem. V'lo amru ella d'lo rachiv chamra v'lo sayim asane. Furthermore, again, the Gemara says, this is also only true if you weren't if you're passing over it on a donkey and not wearing shoes. Aval rachiv chamra v'sayim asani les lanba. But ultimately, again, if you pass over the water riding a donkey or wearing shoes, it's not a problem. V'hani mili heicha deleka lamecha shlikshafim. So both says, remember, this is what I mentioned to you before. There's a whole bunch of different things that are unfolding over here. So we've got shadim and we've got kishuv, and as much as there is a connection between those things, because sometimes, as we've seen before, we saw the story in yesterday's daf of the couple that got divorced, and the woman tried to go ahead and make her ex-husband, harm her ex-husband through kishuv. That kishuv was there to make him susceptible to shadim. So again, there's crossover on these things as well. Kishuv doesn't necessarily have to rely on shadim, but kishuv could employ shadim. So but again, where there is a concern of kishuv, even if you have all of these other measures to protect yourself from the shadim, you may still be in danger. Because there was a guy who was riding on a donkey, the Siye Masani, he was wearing shoes, the Gamar Masani, and again he passed over this water, and what happened? The Gamar Masani, his shoes shriveled up, or his shoes contracted, and his feet shriveled up. Okay? Tanra Banan. Shlosha ein matzin velo mismatzin. So both an interesting case here. There are three people. Look into Rashbam for just a moment. It's the fourth line in the Rashbam. So three people, lo mematzin, or lo mematzin, the Rashbam says, lo yavru bein shnei anashim. So we'll say there are three things that you should not allow to pass in between two people, two men, and there are three things, velo misma'atzin. Rashbam says, velo ya'avor ish echad bein shnei, well, but we'll see. So we'll say there are three things that you should not allow to pass in between two men, and there are three things that a man should not pass in between two of them. So the Gemara says, let's go through the list. These are the three things. Hakelev, a dog, dekel, palm tree, va'isha, and the woman. So we'll say, so what this means is, all three of these things, if there are two men standing, one should not allow these things, or people, to pass in between. And if you're a man, you should not pass in between two of them. So the Gemara says, "V'yesh omrim af hachazir." Some include a chazir in this. "V'yesh omrim af hanachash," and others include a snake. V'mematzin. So we'll say. So again, it's interesting. The list over here is interesting. See, I will say the issue of a woman could be, again, out of this whole list. So again, that could be an issue ultimately, again, of hirhurim, of engendering inappropriate thoughts. If a man walks in between two women, or if a woman walks in between two men. So again, that could easily, one could see how that could lead to a situation of hirhur. Interestingly enough, these other things I will say. So the dekel, remember again, what's the dekel? The dekel, again, because remember, it appears from these Gemaras that shadim seem to hang around palm trees. We're going to see that's going to come up a little bit later on as well. Shadim seem to have the palm trees. And I will say, if you look at the rest of the items, again, the kelev, dogs eat anything. So dogs are considered to be like incredibly unclean animals. Chazir, is the paradigmatic source of tumah, and the nachash, I will say, is the paradigmatic essence of sin. So if you look at this list, what the Gemara is really saying over here is something incredibly profound. That in life, if a person wants to be successful, a person has to distance themselves from challenge. Sometimes we think that, okay, I could stand up to any challenge, and we put ourselves in harm's way, and we put ourselves in challenging circumstances. And then when we fail in those circumstances, we're like shocked. How did this happen? But why did I put myself there to begin with? We say this every day in Berchos HaShachar. We ask Kadosh Baruch Hu, "V'lo lidei nisayon." Don't put me in a situation ultimately where I'm going to be tested. So we'll say, whatever. There's so much to talk about on this concept about not putting oneself in a matzav of nisayon. Right? So much of life is being proactive and avoiding the situations where I get myself in trouble. Both say it's the same way. It's the same way. If a person, Rahman al-Islam, is suffering from a trauma, so right, they're trying to heal from a trauma, so they have to identify for themselves what are their triggers. Or a person is a recovering alcoholic, they have to identify for themselves what are the triggers for the addiction. Every person who's trying to recover from something has to identify the circumstances which are the triggers for their particular matzav. The truth is, we're all in recovery, right? We're all in the spiritual 12-step program. I'm recovering from chait. I'm a chait addict, right? I'm a sin addict. Hi, my name is Shmuel, and I'm right. It's we are. It's the way to look at oneself. And the only shaila in life is how many days are you sober? That's really what it is. How many days have you gone without the particular avera? And there's a recognition that I'm probably going to relapse. I'm probably going to, because that's the way that it is. But part of the way in which I deal with my recovery is I don't put myself in the wrong situations. I don't put myself in the wrong situations. Or both say it's the most profound thing in life because we think that we could stand up to anything, but we can't. We're human beings. So the Gemara says these three things that you shouldn't walk between or shouldn't let them walk between you. We'll say these things represent different levels, whether it's hirhor, impure thoughts, whether it's chait, whether it's tumah. Be careful what you allow yourself to be in proximity to. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, so okay, what happens if it happened? In other words, what happens if let's say you walked in between any of these items, or they walked between two men? What's the halach? So this is very interesting. Amar Papa niftach bekel v'nafsik bekel. So what you do is the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Bamidbar. So the Gemara says, "Kel motziem mitzrayim kisoafos ra'im lo kilo nachash biyakov lo kesef yisrael." So we'll say this is what's interesting. So the pasuk, these psukim begin with kel and they end with kel. So the Gemara says, quote these psukim. Now, what the Gemara is focusing on in these psukim is the fact that it says nichush, right, that sorcery doesn't have any impact on the individual. So it's interesting that the Gemara once again seems to feel that there's some type of kishuf aspect over here. So mention the pasuk that says kishuf has no impact on Klal Yisrael. Okay, so the Gemara says, so what happens? I'm sorry. Niftach or inami niftach below v'nafsik below. Or Rabos again, you quote the pasuk also. Remember, lo ish kel v'yichazev uben adam v'yisnachem. Who amar? Good. So Rabos say. So once again, it's another pasuk that makes reference to the fact that nichush doesn't have an impact on Klal Yisrael. So the Gemara says, hani beitrei dematzalahu isha nida. So we'll say if two men were standing and a woman who's a nida walked in between them. Im tchilas nidasehi horeges achas mehen. If she's at the beginning of her nidus, one of them is going to die. Im sof nidasehi. If she's at the end of her nidus, so mariva osebeinehen. Ultimately, again, they're going to fight. So my takante. So what do you do if a woman who's a nida walks in between two men? Niftach bekel v'nafsik bekel. Quote the pasuk. So the Gemara said, "Well, say." So again, there's so much to speak about on these Gemaras about what exactly does it mean. I just want to point out something amazing. The Gemara says, what do you do if you find yourself in a compromising matzav? What do you do if you find yourself in difficulty? Quote a pasuk, learn Torah. Torah migna umatzla. Torah has the ability to protect. Torah has the ability to save. So when you find yourself in a compromised situation, a spiritually dangerous circumstance, so Allah Alamaisa, just learn. Incredible. Hani treinashi diyasvan parshas drachim. If there are two women who are sitting at the crossroads, chada b'hai gisa d'shvila, v'chada b'idach gisa. One was sitting on one side of the road, one was sitting on the other side of the road. Umichabnan apayu lahadadi, and they're facing each other. The Gemara says, "Vadei b'kshafim askinon, asikon." They're certainly involved in kishuf. So my takante. So what should you do? This is such a great Gemara. What's the takana? take another road. We'll say such an incredible yesod. Sometimes successful living just means bypassing the problem. It just means not going down the road that I know is going to put me in a difficult matzav. Bypass it. So if there's another road, take a different road. What if there's no other road? So listen to this. This is great. If you're traveling with someone else, hold his hand, and walk in between the two, and probably, make sure he's on the same page as you with this. I'll say, but again, go ahead, take his hand, and just walk through. And we'll say, first of all, what an incredible yesod as well. You hear the Musar in this? The Musar in this is, when you're in danger, take the hand of another Jew, because nothing helps a person navigate through tumultuous circumstances like achdus. Right? Take the hand of another Jew and ultimately just walk through. And if you're traveling alone, or you can't hold the hand of the person who you are traveling with, this is what you should say. Agarta azlis, or I should say, Agarta azlis asya belusya miskatla b'cheik kibel. So I'll say, you should say this phrase. This is the names. Rashbam points out over here. Agres, Azla, Osya, Belusya are names of Shadim who apparently involve themselves in Kishuv. All of these individuals, Miskatlin B'cheik Kibel, I've already killed with my bow and arrow. So this is what you should say to the women who are doing the Kishuv, negate the effects of the Kishuv. Okay. Haiman Depaga Be'isisa Be'idna Desaka Metfilas Mitzvah. So I'll say it's an interesting case. What happens if a man runs into a woman after she's coming out of the mikvah? So a woman is coming home from the mikvah after she's been tovel for nida. She's coming back from the mikvah. So the Gemara says, "Ihu kadim umishamesh." If ultimately again he has relations before she has relations, a spirit of immorality will envelop him. Ihu kadma umishamsha. If she has relations first, ultimately, again, a spirit of immorality will encompass her. I will say, now again, interestingly enough, on a basic level, what the Gemara is saying over here is as follows. If a man encounters a woman and he knows that she just went to the mikvah, so he knows what she's going to be doing that night. And she sees him, a man, she knows she's going to be with her husband that night. So the Gemara says something incredibly amazing. Human nature is that thought is impacted by what we see. So I think what Chazal is saying on a deeper level is, when a man runs into a woman who's not his wife, she came into the mikvah, if that man is with his wife that night, it's possible that he may think about this other woman. So the act of thinking about other people in the course of being with one's spouse, Chazal speak about this a lot, how it erodes the fundamental kedusha of marital intimacy. So the Gemara says if he has relations first, it's possible that he's going to be thinking about this woman. If she has relations first, it's possible she's going to be thinking about this man. So that's what it means. Whoever has quote-unquote relations first is going to be enveloped by this spirit of immorality. So maita kante. So what should you do? We'll say once again, leimahachi. Shofech buz al nedivim. He literally spills degradation on the princes. V'yisam b'sohu lo derech. So we'll say. So once again, what you begin to see, and it's really incredible, is what do you do in life when you get yourself into trouble? What do you do? So we'll say. So first advice of Chazal is avoid trouble. That's the first, right? Derech achrisi. Just go down a different path. Go down a different path. That's number one, right? But I will say, but number two is, if you find yourself in trouble, of course, figure out a way to extricate yourself, but anchor yourself in spirituality. Torah is an anchor. Torah is an anchor. And the power of even just saying a pasuk when in the midst of difficulties, we'll say that's what the Gemara is saying. You're in trouble, say a pasuk. I don't know any pasukim by heart. Everyone knows at least one pasuk by heart. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Leimar. That's a pasuk also in the Torah. Say it. Say it. Connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Connect to Torah. Connect yourself to your spiritual anchor. And that'll help you even through the most tumultuous of times. What does it mean when we say to Hashem, when we say about Hashem, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Sorry, this is a person who sleeps in the shade of a single palm tree, or in the shade of the moon. So we'll say apparently, once again, back to Shadim, These are areas where shadim inhabit. And therefore, if you sleep in these places, you put yourself in mortal danger. Furthermore, again, with the single palm tree, that's only if the shade of another palm tree doesn't fall upon it. But if the shade of another palm tree falls upon it as well, less lanba, there's no problem. But what about the case of a person who sleeps, with the brisa that says, person who sleeps in the shade of a single palm tree in the chutzner, or a person who goes out and sleeps in the shade of the moon, is responsible for his own life? What's the case? If you want to say that there's no other shade from any other palm tree that falls upon it, then why is it only a case in the chutzner? It's true even in the field. But rather you see that apparently sleeping in the shade of a single palm tree in the chutzner, even if there's another palm tree that casts its shade there as well, is problematic. And when it comes to the shade of the moon, this is only in the west. But ultimately, again, in the beginning of the month, this is not a problem when he casts his shadow in the east. Good. Amud Beis. Hayman de mafni agirda de dikla. So let's listen to this case. If a person goes ahead and literally passes over, right? The person person relieves themselves on the stump of a palm tree. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Achda, or not, what's the halacha? What's the ramification? Achdi le'ledidei ruach palga. Ruach palga will take hold of them. So we'll say, again, this is also some type of shade. Remember, this is the constant association between shadim and palm trees. So apparently, if you go ahead and you relieve yourself on the stump of a palm tree, you are going to get some shadim upset. So therefore, again, a person is seized by ruach palga. V'hayman dematzli reishe agirda dedikla. Similarly, if a person leans his head on the stump of a palm tree, so what's the halacha? Ach delei ruach tzurada. So he'll be seized by the ruach tzurada. Also, another type of shade. Hayman de pasi adikla. If a person goes ahead and walks over the stump of a palm tree, I miktal katil. So again, if the palm tree died, then the individual who walked over it will die. And if the palm tree was uprooted, then ultimately, again, mi'akar umais, he'll be uprooted and dies. So we'll say, again, either way, it sounds like the guy dies. But lamaisa, there's a chiluk between dying versus being uprooting, which sounds like maybe chas v'shalom impacts a person's mishpacha as well. Hani mili d'lo manach kari alayu. This is the only problem if you step over the stump. But if you put your foot on the stump, ultimately, but if you put your foot on the stump, there is no problem. Good. Chamisha tule havi. So we'll say there are 5 different types of shade. Tula de dikla yichida, the shade which are problematic, right? And there are 5 different types of shade where you have to be careful because literally shadim inhabit these areas. Tula de dikla yichida, the shade of a single palm tree. Tula de kanda. Rashi says over here, kanda also is a type of tree, another shape of the kanda tree. Tula de parcha. But say parcha, interestingly enough, is a tzlaf, a caper bush. We spent a lot of time in Kates and Mavarchan and Brachas about caper bushes, right? Caper bushes, caper berries. So tula, the shade of a caper bush. Tula de zardasa. We'll say zardasa is a sorb apple tree, right? Sorb apple tree. Ika de amri af tula de arba v'tula de arbasa. Others say that it also applies to the shade of a boat, right? I guess the shade of if you stand in the shade of a boat, or tula da arbasa, or the shade of the evening as well. Rashi says over here, no, I'm sorry, arbasa, not the evening, aravas, a willow tree. A willow tree. Okay, so klala de milsa. So we'll say, here's the klal. Kol de nafish ante kashe tulya. Any tree that has a lot of branches, its shade is dangerous. When we say shade is dangerous, that is a place where shadim inhabit. V'chol de kashi siluye, and any tree that has difficult wood. Difficult wood means thorns. Kashe tule. Its shade is harmful as well. So if it has a lot of branches or it has thorns, the shade is difficult because apparently that's a place where shadim congregate. Lebar mikro masa, with the exception of what the Gemara calls kro masa. So the Gemara says, apagav de kashi siluya lo kashi tulya. Ultimately, again, because even though it has thorns, ultimately, again, its shade is not problematic. The amri le shida. So the Gemara says because there was once a shade that said to its son, to its child. If you look at all right, you know what? Let's go back. Well, there's a lot of interesting Rashbam over here as well. So the Gemara says, let's go back. So the Amri, sorry, now I lost it. The Amri le Shida Lebra, because there was once a shade who said to her son, Pirche nafshech mikaro masa, go ahead and run away from this particular tree. The ihu de kakata la avucha, the katlida, because this tree cost your father his life, and ultimately again will cost you your life as well. Rav Ashi said, Abosai, first wide line, Chazina Rav Kahana, the parish mikulu tuli. I saw that Rav Kahana was careful to avoid all shady trees. He just avoided all shade. He just avoided shade in general because, again, out of a concern that wherever there is a shaded area, shadim will occupy that area as well. So both say Bei Parchi Ruchi. So both say, remember again. So we go back to the caper bush, right? So the caper bush, one has to be concerned ultimately again with ruach. The Bei Zardosa Shida. So the Gemara says the Beisha Dasa Zida, she the same thing with the area with the sorb apples, right? One has to be careful because of shadim. The Be Igri Rishpi. So we'll say these are just the different names of the shadim which occupy these areas. Rooftops have the shade called Rishpi. Lamay Nafkim, we'll say, what does it matter to us what the different names of the shadim are? In other words, for our purposes, shadim are shadim, and should be avoided. To which the Gemara says lekimiya. So we'll say, remember again, there was the concept of writing an amulet, and for an amulet to work, it had to be shade specific. So therefore, if you're having a particular problem with shadim, you would want to know what type of shade you are having a problem with. So the Gemara says, "Debei parchi." So debei parchi beria she'in la inayim. So I will say the shade of bei parchi, which is the shade that occupies the caper bush, just to know it doesn't have eyes. Doesn't have eyes. So my nafkamina, what does it matter if it has eyes or it doesn't have eyes? Very important. Ligizuzele. Knowing you could run away from it. So if a shade that doesn't have eyes, you can run away from it. It's good to know. So we'll say one time there was a particular Talmid Chacham who was going to relieve himself on a caper bush. Shama deka asi iluye, the gazila. Ultimately, I will say, so he heard a rustling in the caper bush. He knew that it was a shade, and he ran away. Ki azla. So ultimately, again, when the shade started running after him, so apparently the shade stumbled a little bit. Chabke ledikla. The shade grabbed onto a palm tree. Savach dikla upakahi. Apparently, the palm tree cried out, and the shade exploded. Parcha de Bei Zardasa. Shidi. So the Gemara says, Parchi de Bei Zardasa, Shidi. So we'll say ultimately again. So remember, going back to the sorb apple tree. So we have shading that occupy that as well. Hazar dasa the smicha lamasa lo parcha mishisin shidi. So we'll say, and by the way, if you have a sorb apple tree that's next to the city, there is no less than 60 shadim which occupy it. So apparently sorb apple trees by cities have a very large shade population by them. What is this? To go ahead and write an amulet. So you should understand that if you're writing an amulet for someone who's impacted by shadim, by a sorb apple tree, by a city, that's not just going to be one shade, that's going to be many shadim. Gemara tells a story. Hobar kasha demasa, the azul v'kai, gabe zardasa, tava samach lamasa. So there was a guy. Rashi says, Bar Kasha is a shoter ha'ir, like the sheriff of the town. The sheriff of the town went ahead and was standing by the sorb apple tree that was next to the city. Alu beishisin shidin. 60 shadim entered into this guy or surrounded him, v'istakin, and he was in danger. So there was a Talmid Chacham who came along. Talmid Chacham was trying to help, but he didn't do Pesachim Daf Kofyud Aleph Amud Beis. See, he did not know that sorb apple trees in proximity to the city often have 60 shadim. So what happened? Kasav le kamiyah lechada shida. So the Talmid Chacham wrote a kamiyah. He wrote an amulet to help this individual who was negatively impacted by the shadim. But he wrote an amulet for one shade. Even though the guy was impacted by 60 shadim. So I'll say, so what happened? This is great. Shama, so the Talmid Chacham heard the talu chinga begabe, they kamisharu haki. So what happens? I will say the shadim, they started playing their instruments. Literally, they put their instruments in the tree, in the sorb apple tree, and they started singing. And what do they say? Sudrei demar kisur merabanan, badikna be bemar delo yada baruch ata. We'll say, so the shadim gave this Talmid Chacham a lot of musar. You dress the part. You certainly look like a Talmid Chacham, but it's clear that you don't even know Baruch Ata. We'll say, right? Can you imagine getting Musar from Shadim? So I'll say, so what they were saying to this guy, to his Talmid Chacham was, you look the part of a Talmid Chacham, but you clearly don't know the halacha, because everyone knows that a sorb apple tree by the city has at least 60 shadim, and all you did was write the kamiyah for one shade. So the Gemara says, as follows: Also, Mirabanan, the other, the Zardas, the Shis, and Shady Hava. So another time Chacham came who knew about the fact that sorab apple trees often have 60 shadim. Kasav Lekima, the Shis and Shidi, and ultimately again he wrote a Kamiya. He wrote an amulet for 60 shadim. Shama de Ka'amru Panu Manaycho Mehacha, and he heard ultimately again the shadim say, "Let's pack it up, guys. Right? We're out of here now that there's a Kamiya for 60 shadim. Let's go." Incredible. Katav Meriri, so we'll say ultimately again, what is Ketav Meriri? Now we'll say Ketav Meriri is a phrase that's found in the Tochacha. What does this refer to? Trey Katvi Havu. The Gemara will say, if you take a look at the Rashbam, so the Rashbam says as follows. The Rashbam says, okay, well let's see the Gemara. So Ketav Meriri, so the Gemara says, so Trey Katvi Havu, Chad Mikamei Tiara, V'chad mi basar tihara. So ultimately, we'll say there are two different types of shadim, or two different types of spirits. One ultimately again before the moon, and one after the moon. Dimikamei tiara ketev miriri shmo. The spirit from before the moon ultimately is called ketev miriri. Umechse bekanda de kamcha v'hadir bebachsha, and it has the appearance ultimately again, literally again, we'll say bekada de kamcha means a receptacle of flour that ultimately is being mixed. The basar tiara ketev yashud tzarayim shemo. The one that comes after the moon is called ketev yashud tzarayim. Umechse bekarna deiza v'hadir beknafia, and it often exists by the horns of the goat, and it looks like the flour that's gone through the sieve. Okay, Abai have a shakal va'azil. So let's listen to this story. So Abai was traveling. So the Gemara says, va'azil Rav Papa miyamine. Rav Papa was standing on his right side. Rav Huna b'Rav Yeshua mismali. Rav Huna b'Rav Yeshua was on his left side. Chaz yalahu ketev meriri de ka'asi lape. He saw the shade ketev meriri that was coming towards him. So he saw the ketev, the shade ketev meriri, which is a dangerous shade, was coming on his left side. So we'll say, look what happened. Ahadra l'Rav Papa l'smalei. So we'll say, so what did Abaye do? Abaye took Rav Papa, who was on his right, and put him to his left, and Rav Yeshua was on his left, put him to his right. Amali Rav Papa, Ana Maishnad lo chashish. Rav Papa says to Abaye, it's very nice that you took care of Rav Huna, right? You didn't want Rav Huna to come in contact with Ketev Beriri, but you put me right in the pathway of Ketev Meriri. Why would you have done that? Rabbi said, this is incredible. Amrli at shaita kayam eslacha. You don't have to worry. Your mazel is strong, right? Your mazel is strong. Now, why did he say to Rav Papa that your mazel is strong? So this is very interesting. Take a look at the Rashbam. The Rashbam says, Shaita kaimelacha. It's four lines up from the bottom. Ashir ata v'yesh lecha mazel tov v'lo tizuk. You're rich. So because you're rich, you have good mazel, and because you have good mazel, the shadim aren't going to have an impact on you. Now I will say, now it can't just mean because he was rich. It must have been because ultimately he had Torah as well. But he was saying clearly you have good mazel. You're a Talmud Chacham, you have a lot of money, so your mazel is good. Because your mazel is good, ultimately the shade can't have any impact on you. Quite amazing. So the Gemara says, Michal b'Tammuz ad shis sarbei v'adai shchichi. From the 1st of Tammuz until the 16th of Tammuz, shadim are around. Mikan ve'elech, safek shchichi, safek lo shchichi. But from here on in, it's a safek if they're found around. Umidishtachi betule dechatzba telo chatzev garmida. So the Gemara says, and furthermore, if you look at the Rashbam, he says, where could shadim be found? So he says, mishtacha betule dechatzba, or dechatzuva, chatzev isav sheticham bo Yehoshua as aretz etzaretz Yisrael telo chatzev garmida. They can be found in this type of grass that has not yet grown in Amma. Ubetuli de tzafra upanya telo havi garmida. And then once again, they can also be found in the shade of the morning and in the evening, where the shade does not cast its shadow for up to an amma. The ikar betuli de beis hakisei. But where could the shade the most acutely be found? In the shade of the beis hakisei. We'll say we've seen this before. This goes back to brachas. Now remember, it goes back to the idea that shadim primarily inhabit unoccupied areas. Remember, their outhouses were often far removed from habitation. They weren't where people normally were. You had to walk out a little bit. That was a place ultimately again of sakana from shadim as well. So we'll say we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with Amar Rav Yosef tomorrow. Still continuing on the topic a bit more of shadim and zugos as well. Amir Hashem. Shkach, we'll say.